You're listening to Mapping Minds.
Welcome back, everyone. So in the first episode, I mentioned how psychedelics have had a profoundly therapeutic effect on my life. While it's hard to overstate the medicinal potential of these substances, especially when combined with therapy, it's important not to understate the risk involved. That's why, for the last few years, I've volunteered as a harm reductionist at events and festivals. What that means is I've worked alongside medical professionals and other volunteers to provide peer support for people having overwhelming drug experiences. The goal of harm reduction is to both reduce the risk and the stigma associated with mind-altering substances. My guest today is Erica Siegel, a friend I made doing this work and someone I deeply admire. We met when she was a volunteer coordinator at the Zendo Project, one of the larger organizations in this field, and have worked together at her own company called Nest Harm Reduction. She's also an mdma-assisted psychotherapist in the Phase 3 clinical trials. In this episode, we talk about her history of working in community mental health, how she got into working with psychedelics, the lack of mental health literacy in policing, and her goals for Nest in the future. Enjoy this conversation with Erica Siegel.
It's a lot about the duality of the situation, as we see kind of psychedelic research get to the finish line or get close to the finish line. There are bumps in the road, as there are with any journey to healing. You get part of it that's dark, and you get a lot of shadow work, and you continue to move forward in the most ethical and with the most integrity that you possibly can. But really being able to look, I have it up there, my goals.
Panda goals: make the world a more compassionate place, be the change, stay focused, fuck the haters, they only distract you. So
those are my life goals. Really, I mean, if the main goal, if the main focus is to just make the world a more compassionate place, to help people facilitate healing as we all become more and more engaged and awake and enraged about what's happening in the world around us. The more connected we become, the more pain we feel.
Yeah. How'd you get into this work? What's your story? I don't know much about your trajectory and more than just your professional background, but why would you even endeavor to do this in the first place?
I owe it all to my parents, which is mostly true. I was raised with a really strong spiritual connection to Judaism. And it's never been a questioning, wavering thing for me. And the parts of Judaism and who I am and we can talk about multi-generational trauma and all of that stuff. But the two things that resonate most with me in Judaism is tikkun olam, which is the Hebrew word for repairing the world. There's a really beautiful story that talks about how the world is made up of broken pieces of a glass or broken pieces of a plate. It's part of the rituals, and when we break things as Jews, it's because it's a constant reminder of the work we have to do in this world to take something that's broken and help it become whole. And my dad has always taught me that it's not about being better than anybody else. It's not about the Jews are better than the Christians or the Jews are better than the Muslims. It's literally about this internal process of how do you live in the most integrity? And how do you be better than you were yesterday? It has nothing to do about anything external. It's all about like living a Jewish life to me is living a life that is working to make the world more compassionate, to facilitate healing, and to like challenge myself every day to be a little bit better.
Yeah, that's something that I really haven't come to appreciate until very recently with Judaism, how a lot of these stories are about imperfect people. They're about like really kind of like people in like a process. It's not like the Jewish God is calling the best person for the job. It's like
Never.
it's often someone like Abraham, like living. He's like doesn't have any kids and he's like 80 years old or whatever. It's something,
Yeah.
and that even that person has potential to offer to the community.
Yeah. There's something about having been raised kind of in this like reform conservative modern orthodoxy-ness that exists in my family. I was raised pretty conservative, but grew up in a home that became more religious as I grew up. We became kosher. We started keeping kosher when I was, I think, 8. And really having this connection to like what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be part of the Jewish diaspora, what it means to be a very small minority in a big broken world, and how do we stand up for like the rights of ourselves, but for the rights of everybody else also. And that's kind of like the what I got out of my childhood Jewish education.
So from there, did you always want to do a career in helping people, or like has that always felt like a calling, or was there some experience that sort of converted you to that?
Since I was little, I always thought I was going to be a chef. I always thought I was going to go into the restaurant business. My undergrad, I went to Cornell and did my undergrad degree at the hotel school there.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so I worked in hospitality. I thought that for me, it's always been about pleasure. I've always wanted to bring people sensational pleasure and like healing and growth through that. And I love cooking. And it's like a therapy. It's like a meditation for me. And so I always thought that I would feed people and make them feel good. And then I got into the restaurant business and I didn't feel like I was doing enough. It didn't feel authentic to me being in that industry, like putting on a suit every day and taming my hair and putting on makeup and heels and like going to work, like never felt authentic to me. And so I looked for other ways to help people heal, and I found social work and it resonated with me.
How old were you when you transitioned out of that career and into social work?
I went to grad school. I started in 2008, so I was like 28.
Wow, so you had already been like kind of a full ass grown up, and then you just decided I'm gonna jettison this life and go back to school for social work.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was a really big shift for me, kind of walking away from a path that I thought was the path that I was going to be on for my whole life. But walking it felt really uncomfortable and really inauthentic. So I kind of jumped ship and I was like, that's it. I'm going to go be a social worker now. um, And it was a quick decision. It was like the universe like opened every single door. Like it was, I just made the decision and said it out loud. And then like 2 weeks later I was in grad school.
Wow. So how long did you work like as a social worker? Like what did you do out of school?
So I worked in school when you're doing your master's to be a therapist or social or clinical social worker. You do clinical hours during grad school, and I worked here in Los Angeles, in South Central, and in Redondo Beach for like a community mental health dual diagnosis clinic. So I did community mental health during grad school, and then I moved to Santa Cruz and I worked for an agency there for a couple of years. And that's where I met all the MAPS people. that kind of started my path down psychedelic research.
So basically,
Yeah.
you did your in-school clinical hours doing community health, and what are some of the things that you noticed there? Because I feel like that's a population that's very underserviced in ways that are like hard to articulate, hard to really grapple with.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like not many social workers can weather that work for that long, or like some people kind of age out really quick because you're confronted all the time with like what you can change and what you actually can't.
Right. It's really hard. It really puts you in touch with the parts of your community that you probably don't want to see. People who are forgotten by the system, people who are unjustly part of the system. And there is a ton of secondary trauma and professional burnout in the social worker field. So much so that I started a company that specifically focuses on vicarious trauma for first responders as a program, and got trained as a compassion fatigue specialist because I watched all of my friends kind of burn out, trying so incredibly hard to service populations and service areas and service communities that are incredibly underfunded, that are pretty much a result of systemic racism, a result of horrible government policies that continue to damage vulnerable populations and the disenfranchised. And that's exactly the population who social workers serve, are vulnerable populations. And so it kind of like puts you through the ringer in grad school, but also gives you a lot of perspective and helps you grow as a service provider, as a care provider, and as a psychotherapist.
So was it any of that burnout that drew you away from that work, or did you find like what basically what I'm asking is psychedelics. How did that happen, and why would you go that route as opposed to other avenues that were open to you?
I mean, white privilege. Honestly, I am a like well-to-do Jewish white girl from the Midwest who exists in the hippie, like festival underground, subculture. And I got called out a lot when I worked in community mental health for my privilege. And so I moved into easier populations to serve. I moved into kind of serving a population that more resonated with me.
Yeah, basically the efficacy of your work was hindered by you not being of the
That
community.
community. Yeah. Even though I was there being like, hey, I'm here, I'm showing up, I want to be of service to this community. And like the system was like, this is a white privileged girl, please don't trust her. And it was a huge deficit to go into those neighborhoods and to go into those communities that I really was I wanted to learn, I wanted to be of service. And I still do. And I still, we can go down the whole road of like, we're all one. Like, really, I believe in the we're one big earth community. But I also want to recognize that there are communities here that have been ravaged by the drug war and ravaged by racist policies. And I would love to figure out ways to serve them more. But it's definitely not my community, and I'm very much approached as an outsider, especially as a social worker.
So you're in grad school, and in your free time, I assume you're going to parties or raves or Burning Man or things like this. And
Never, actually.
Never?
No, my first burn was in 2011 after I finished grad school, because my education always conflicted with Burning Man. And I was never a raver. Also not my community. I am a bluegrassy, Grateful Dead fish head. And so I would do a lot of live music and be part of that community. Yeah.
So you've always felt like you belong to that space. And then when the psychedelic therapy opened up to you as an opportunity that you could pursue professionally, it just was a natural fit for you.
Yeah. It was a natural fit for me. I definitely really enjoy working with people in altered states. I think that it's fascinating. I think that there's a lot of deep healing work that's done in altered states. And I think that it's a significantly vulnerable population that is often taken advantage of in those states. And so it really resonated with me that it was like, here are all these vulnerable, challenging psychedelic experiences without safe containers.
So let's dive more into that. When did you, because it's a very special class of therapists who've gotten to be in the position to work with these substances at all. How did you get in with all that? Was it purely like the social network, or how does that work?
I had just moved to LA and I had been volunteering with MAPS. I tabled with Brian Brown for a couple of events and I worked one Zendo, I think. And so I moved to LA because I knew that psychedelic assisted psychotherapy was something that I was interested in doing. I was a volunteer with the Zendo Project. And the Zendo Project kind of worked as if you're interested in psychedelic therapy, like volunteer and see if this is something that resonates with you, which was a great way for MAPS to find therapists that are interested in this work. And so I had a couple of contacts and I knew that there was going to be a mdma-assisted psychotherapy clinical trial in LA that was going to be run by Charlie Grobe and Alicia Danforth. It was a pilot study for mdma-assisted psychotherapy for social anxiety in autistic adults. And I sent Charlie and Alicia an email that was like, hey, I like MAPS. Is there anything I can do? If you need help with anything, please let me know. And they were like, great, we don't have anything for you. And then like 3 months, I set a calendar reminder like 3 months later being like, hey guys, still here, still totally willing to do anything that you want. And then I think like 8 months after I sent the first email, I got an email back from them saying, hey, we'd like you to come in and interview for this study coordinator position. And I came in to Dr. Grobe's office at LA Biomed. And if you've ever seen like Have a Nice Trip on Netflix, he's interviewed in this office that he's been there for 30 years. And it's like stacks of paper and books and like poorly lit. And you like walk in and, you know, and Charlie keeps his calendar in his front pocket. And so it's very hard to schedule him since at the time he wasn't doing digital scheduling. And I came in and I think like 3 or 4 times throughout that process, they asked me in different ways of like, you know, that if you do this, like you can never, ever, ever do anything underground, ever. Because it will question our validity as researchers. And I was like, yes. They're like, you are okay with never, ever being an underground therapist ever. And I'm like, yes. And then they're like, okay. And then they called me like a week later and came in again. And they're like, hey, we just want to make sure. And I was like, yeah, I want to be like an above ground researcher. I will do what I need to do to. And Charlie and Alicia were like, great. And they hired me on to this very small pilot study as a volunteer. And I kind of got to know the research protocols and do all the screenings for subjects and really kind of learn the ropes of psychedelic research from one of the best. And yeah.
So when they say you can't do anything underground, they're meaning like underground psychedelic
Therapy. Yeah.
assisted therapy.
Yeah.
Because there's like that. It's people say it's common. I've never like been in the circles to know about who does this, but like apparently a lot of therapists are doing their own,
Well, I mean, the MDMA assisted psychotherapy community was an above ground community until 1985 or 1986 when the federal government decided that the recreational use of it was too societally dangerous and they made it Schedule 1. All of those therapists were doing good, legal, ethical work prior to a federal law that was a discriminatory, unjustified law. MDMA was never supposed to stop being used in the therapeutic community. And so there are people out there that have been doing this work ethically to their ethics because they feel like doing this work is life-saving in some cases. And I am a very outspoken, above-ground psychedelic therapist and won't compromise my license. And so I think anybody who is doing underground work won't communicate that with me.
Yeah.
I don't think so. And I fully respect, everybody, like where everybody is on their journey and everybody's place in the psychedelic community.
How long have you been working as a therapist with MDMA?
I've been a therapist on 2 protocols, phase 2 open label and a phase 3 double-blind placebo study that's currently ongoing.
So do you still feel as bright-eyed optimistic as you did initially, or what are some insights that you are allowed to share about like your kind of forecast of this as a treatment modality?
Well, things are a little weird for me. I don't know if weird's the right word, but things are a little... So I'm not currently working, even though phase 3 is still going with the pandemic, with COVID. I was actually taking off the second half of phase 3, so I'm not currently working on an active protocol because I thought that Nest would be going all summer long and I would not have availability to see more psychedelic therapy clients.
Real quick, Nest is your new project, which is harm reduction services are provided at events and for mentoring, and now repurposing for just general compassion based training for all sorts of different organizations.
Yes. Yeah. And so NEST, it's an acronym. It stands for the Network of Emotional Support Teams. And so it's a harm reduction based compassionate care service provider. And we provide psychoeducation, trauma-informed trainings, leadership workshops, and integration for post-COVID workplaces. And so for workplaces that might have a lot of employees that are experiencing compassion fatigue or secondary trauma, they can reach out to us and we can facilitate some psychoeducation and emotional support groups for people who are experiencing that. And then also we more recently are developing protocols and procedures for companies that are looking for more trauma-informed workplaces and compassionate care. Well, it's a lot of words.
So that's
so much. Edit that.
So that's Nest.
Yeah.
But because you're not able to go into the event world, it's on pause right now, largely because of what's going on.
It's pivoting. It's not pausing. It's pivoting.
It's pivoting. But then bring me back to the therapy.
Yeah. So I paused. So the way that clinical trials work are there protocols that are submitted to the FDA, and those protocols are approved for a certain number of subjects. And then they stop, and then they look at all the data, and then they figure out how to move forward. And so that's just how the research community works. If you know anything about evidence-based research or peer-reviewed, like evidence-based practices, It's a long, treacherous road to prove efficacy and to take an experimental drug, experimental medicine to market safely. And so we're waiting for the data analysis of this, and then we're on track for expanded access to begin hopefully in the next 12 to 18 months. Again, the pandemic has kind of put everything on pause, and we'll see how it goes. But anything with research, if there is a hiccup, if there is a severe adverse reaction, things like that, everything has to pause. And the path moving forward is always uncertain. That's what research is.
Mm-hmm. So expanded access would just mean like more therapists will be able to
So
use this?
expanded access would be that there's really specific recruitment protocols, and in expanded access, there might be more flexibility around it. So maybe you'll have more integration therapy sessions instead of just 3. Like maybe instead of having your medicine sessions spaced 4 weeks apart, like they are written in this protocol, like maybe we can space it out every 2 months and extend it so you have more integration. And so there's a possibility of kind of the protocol being a little bit more flexible with people's scheduling and the way that we kind of look at this treatment when it goes to market. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No. I think it's clear. Basically, the initial study is to demonstrate some efficacy, and so you need to have a metric in which that works. If you don't have some sort of population that you're meeting, like some demonstrable need for, then you can't really justify moving on to a broader population.
That's why it's like very complicated. Obviously, there's only so many study sites, and you have to live within a certain radius of that study site to be able to make it to these appointments, and then also have a support person who can drive you to and from the medicine sessions. And if you, for example, are a military veteran with PTSD living in San Diego and Los Angeles is the closest site, driving 2.5 hours each way for an appointment isn't going to be feasible, and it's not going to be successful. And so part of it is, do we feel like you are resourced enough in your support system and in your location and in your work schedule, depending on what your job is, that matches up with the availability of researchers to even participate. And so it's not so much about whether or not you would qualify. It's like time and circumstance and setting, really.
Yeah. To go back to the social work in these vulnerable populations, specifically Black people in America, who are disproportionately affected by the drug war, psychedelic therapy seems to me a really important, and harm reduction in general is a really important praxis to address some of these needs in like a real practical way. And so it seems to me like harm reduction is something that can really serve better outside of the festival world, this kind of very like upper class population, and coming to working class communities. It doesn't seem like there's really been much effort on this front, and I think that Ness is kind of like something that it's more on your radar. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that there is a huge amount of harm reduction efforts reaching out into the Black, Indigenous, people of color communities that are disproportionately affected by the drug war. I think the Harm Reduction Coalition does a great job doing outreach and doing Narcan trainings and doing vulnerable population outreach and education around sex and sexual health and IV drug use. I think that they do a lot of work in that way. I think that the subsection of harm reduction that is this psychedelic harm reduction or festival or event-based harm reduction peer support is a model that we don't really see outside of our own community. And so Nest is kind of working to bridge these services of holding space for someone, bearing witness to somebody's truth, helping people resolve a traumatic or challenging experience. Nest is starting to kind of do that outreach into the greater community and do what we call compassionate care, which is not peer support. I think, especially when working with altered states, especially when working with vulnerable populations, there's a part of it that is peer-to-peer support, but I also know that there's a significant power dynamic going on between people who are altered or traumatized who are seeking help and people who are holding space or providing services. To me, that doesn't sound peer-to-peer because there's an inherent power differential between those two. And therefore, I want to be more vocal about it being like we're providing compassionate care to somebody in need instead of providing psychedelic or just general peer support. And so I think that couples really well with, the more concrete harm reduction services like condoms and earplugs and safe use items and education. I think compassionate care is a little bit more honest with what we do.
Why this comes to mind is George Floyd, who we are in the wake of all these protests over his death. Methamphetamines and fentanyl were found in the autopsy. And looking at some of the footage of police interactions with people who are on substances, it's clear to me from, the little volunteering I've done in the harm reduction world that police officers are often not very comfortable or familiar with altered states, and the oppositional dynamic is something that they just don't have a way to neutralize and de-escalate.
No, I don't think that it's part of their culture. I don't think it's part of the police force culture or the military culture is to de-escalate. I think that that's not a skill that many people who are police officers believe that they have enough training in. I mean, if we want to talk about, social services responding to 911 calls, I also don't think that unless there is systemic change and a comprehensive training in de-escalation and empathy and being able to actively listen and be patient with people, I don't think that there's going to be much change. I hope that Nest has the opportunity. I hope that I have the opportunity to be able to train people and talk to people about those techniques that might work in those situations. Yeah. And be able to kind of help people see people who are in distress as people who are in distress and need help and not a threat. And I think that's a really hard differential because I think police officers and law enforcement are trained to assess for threats and neutralize threats. They're not there to provide compassion to a situation. They are literally there to be the shortest way to end a situation. Unfortunately, a lot of times that ends in violence, but they are there to end it, and then maybe social services will come and visit or somebody will go to jail and there's a domestic dispute and then it's handled in a very confusing, complicated court system. I mean, it's not their job. Nobody wants that job.
Yeah. And and that's the thing that's so confounding about this problem is it's not like there's like a racist cop or like a violent police officer. It's like it's the system is sort of designed in a way to not prioritize the kind of care that many of the situations that they're encountering really call for.
And in more cases than not, especially in the Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, calling the cops makes things worse more
Yeah.
often than not. And so why would we continue relying on a service that's doing the exact opposite of what their intention is?
Yeah. Then what? Because I feel like in my conversations with you, you've been really aware of and conscious of these things in your structuring of Nest. What is on the horizon for Nest, and like where are you trying to move your work toward, and kind of like bringing some of these insights into the community?
Well, I'm really excited about the kind of pivot into the private sector and away from festivals and events. I think that the pandemic has given everyone a complex traumatic event that has given people kind of an opening for them to start healing more of their systemic trauma. And so I think that kind of the pandemic hit everybody, and we had really interesting trauma responses to it. When I talk about trauma, there are single event traumatic events that will cause our sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, to kind of kick into action. And then there are longer experiences like a pandemic or like a traumatic relationship breakup that lasts 4 to 6 months or years or what, these really complex trauma incidents that cause us to kind of have these existential crises and reevaluate what's important to us. And I think that kind of cracked open the door to us taking a look at this bigger systemic complex trauma that we all share as a country, which is systemic racism and the treatment of people of color in this country, and the way that we can create more equity. There's a lot of pain that's happening right now, and I also think that it's going to give way to a lot of healing. And in that healing work, the more we can kind of look at the trauma that we all carry with us that needs to get healed, I think the better off that we'll be. And so Nest, in its pivot, is really starting to provide people the education and language and tools to start talking about their own personal trauma stories.
And so, can you share specifically what that looks like?
So yeah, it's actually it's broken down into a kind of the newest model is broken down into 4 steps. And so the first thing that I do is I meet with the company leadership. I meet with kind of the teams and the people managers and really kind of figure out exactly what their organization needs and what their goals are as an organization, whether it's getting back to work and improving productivity or slowing down and looking at moving into different sectors. And so with that, we really do like a complex needs assessment. I mean, what a restaurant might need in a return to work program versus a law office versus like a Vegas casino, like they all need different tools for their employees and for their customers. So step 1, we do a needs assessment. Step 2, I come in and give them like an educational base around trauma. What language we use, what's happening in people's bodies when it's happening, how to talk about it, how to hold space for people when they're having a challenging experience, and kind of when to recognize that somebody's having a mental health crisis. And then from there, I can provide services that are kind of like one-on-one, how to hold space for people managers. So let's say for HR directors or for general managers that have a customer service base that works underneath them, really giving them the tools how to hold space, how to create boundaries, and how to really use your workplace to create a container that's appropriate for the goals of the company and also provides support to the employees who might be going through a challenging experience. And then there's this like last step, which is really doing like a systems implementation. So, what do you want your company to look like? It can be broken down, or what do you want your policies to kind of look like moving forward? And those would be an integration of harm reduction, better mental health services, possibly a kind of debrief after a traumatic event support group. So maybe all of the employees or whatever your teams are working together can come down and be able to share their experience of what it was like and how they're moving forward. So at least it's out and everybody knows about it. And it's like, hey, I had a really hard time teaching my kids and keeping up with my workload. Great. Now I know that this person like has kids and is struggling at home. How can I as their manager or as their teammate provide them with better support so we can work together? So it's really about opening up dialogue and giving a language to the teams to be able to communicate their needs better.
So some of that sounds like the kind of thing that historically anyway, people would just look at as being like, yeah, I mean, we all have problems, like figure it out. Like that seems to be the level of emotional depth that employers tend to approach their employees' problems, even something big like this, like if or more so even like everyone's has this trauma, so it's it's not unique to you. So what would be your response to that? Like why even provide the service when life is hard and everyone's figuring this shit out?
What a shitty outlook. What a shitty, selfish outlook. And some companies will say that. And I'll say, great, I'm not for you. We're not for everyone. I'm not here to change people's minds about the way that they want to live life. But what I'm finding is that there are companies out there, that there are entrepreneurs out there, and there are organizations out there that actually do care about their employees and want to make their workplaces better and want to make a more lasting, sustainable, productive, healthier place to work. And maybe that is partially working at home now and partially working at an office. But regardless, I mean, I would like to think that there are companies out there that genuinely care about whether or not their employees are happy.
Yeah.
And if you're not one of those companies, like, what a sad, miserable life you're living.
Right.
Because my goal is to make the world a more compassionate place.
And I think you're doing that. All right, Erica. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you for listening to Mapping Minds. If you would like to support the podcast, you can follow us on social media, leave a review, or just share with a friend.